In the summer of 1946, Hungary printed a banknote worth 100 quintillion pengő. That is a 1 followed by 20 zeros. It remains the largest denomination ever put into general circulation, anywhere, in the history of money. When people picture runaway inflation, they usually picture one of two things: Zimbabwe's famous $100 trillion note, or Germans in 1923 hauling their wages home in wheelbarrows. But Zimbabwe's note only has 14 zeros. And Germany, at its absolute worst, had prices doubling every 3 to 4 days. That sounds apocalyptic, and it ranks 5th on the all-time list. Hungary in July 1946 had prices doubling every 15 hours. By the end, every pengő banknote in the country, all of it added together, was worth a fraction of 1 American cent. So this video is really two questions. How does money break that badly? And once it has broken, how do you ever fix it? Because Hungary's fix worked almost overnight, and it stuck for 80 years. First, one idea you need, and it takes 30 seconds. Money has no value of its own. A banknote is a claim on real things: bread, fuel, an hour of someone's work. A price is just the exchange rate between the paper and the stuff. Print more paper, while the amount of stuff stays the same, and each note claims a smaller slice. Prices rise. That is inflation. A little of it is normal. Most central banks deliberately aim for about 2% a year. So the real question is, what turns 2% into the bread costs double by Thursday? And historically, the answer is almost always the same: a government that must spend, cannot tax, cannot borrow, and owns a printing press. Hungary in 1945 was that situation in its purest possible form. The country had fought the Second World War on the losing side, and then became the battlefield. The siege of Budapest leveled the capital, and the retreating German army dropped every Danube bridge in the city into the river on the way out. Roughly 40% of Hungary's national wealth was gone. What survived was under Soviet occupation, and the peace terms billed Hungary for reparations, plus the cost of supplying the army occupying it. So the state had enormous bills, no functioning tax system, and nobody on earth willing to lend to it. Exactly one machine still worked: the printing press. Now, here is where it stops being a printing problem and becomes something worse. You would think inflation moves at the speed of the printer. It does not. It moves at the speed of fear. The government prints money to pay its bills, and prices rise. That means the taxes it does collect are worth less by the time they arrive. So the hole in the budget grows, so it prints more. Then the public catches on. Once everyone knows money loses value overnight, nobody holds it. Wages are spent within hours of being paid. Money starts moving through the economy faster and faster, and that speed pushes prices up all by itself. Past a certain point, prices rise faster than the presses can physically run. The government is pouring water into a bucket that leaks faster the more you pour. Economists call it hyperinflation once prices rise more than 50% in a month. Hungary went slightly past that. In July 1946, the monthly rate reached 41.9 quadrillion percent, which works out to about 207% per day. A worker paid in the morning had lost roughly 40% of that wage by dinner. The paper trail from that summer is absurd. The zeros grew so fast that Hungary invented new words to hide them. First came the mil pengő, worth 1 million pengő. Then the b pengő, worth 1 trillion. So the record-setting note never actually says 100 quintillion. It says 100 million b pengő. There are photographs from Budapest that summer of street sweepers pushing drifts of banknotes into the gutter. The money was no longer worth the act of bending down. The government did try to protect people. It created a second inflation-proof unit called the pengő, the tax pengő, revalued every day against an index of prices. It worked so well that by July it had largely replaced the ordinary pengő in daily life. Then the pengő started collapsing too. On July the 11th, the National Bank issued the 100 million b pengő note, the one with the 20 implied zeros. On the day of release, it was worth roughly 20 US cents. The bank had already printed the next one up, worth 1 sextillion pengő, a 1 followed by 21 zeros. It was never issued. The currency died first. One uncomfortable wrinkle before we fix this. Some economists argue the inflation was not entirely an accident. A state that cannot collect taxes can still tax people by printing, quietly draining value from everyone holding cash and spending it on bridges and railways. Others say it was pure desperation, one emergency decision at a time, and historians still argue about it. Either way, somebody paid for the reconstruction. It was whoever held pengő. Which brings us to the good question. If prices are doubling every 15 hours, how do you ever stop? Here is what you might guess. Turn off the printer, cross out the zeros, launch a new currency with a patriotic name. Hold that thought because Zimbabwe is going to test it for us. What Hungary actually did on the 1st of August 1946 was launch the forint. The conversion rate is a summary of the entire previous year. One forint cost 400 octillion pengő, a 4 followed by 29 zeros. 4 billion copies of the highest denomination note in human history added up to one forint. One forint was worth about 8.5 US cents. Nobody seriously converted, of course. The old notes went into the gutters and the street sweepers handled the rest. So why did anyone trust forint number 1 when pengő number 100 quintillion had just hit zero? Because the promise underneath the paper changed in ways ordinary people could actually check. First, the gold came home. Hungary's central bank gold reserve, around 30 tons of it, had been evacuated west by train in the last winter of the war and ended up in American custody in Austria. In 1946, the United States gave it back, and that returned reserve stood behind the new forint. Second, the budget was repaired for real. Taxes were rebuilt and actually collected, the state payroll was cut, and the central bank was legally barred from simply printing whatever the government asked for. And here is the detail that proves what inflation really is. The presses did not even stop. Hungary's money supply more than tripled over the rest of 1946, and prices barely moved, because this time people believed the budget behind the paper. The inflation was never about the paper, it was about the promise. Hungary went from the fastest inflation ever recorded to roughly zero, almost overnight. The forint is still Hungary's currency today, 80 years later. By the standards of this video, that makes it immortal. Which brings us to the country everyone thinks holds the record, and to the world championship of crossing out zeros. Zimbabwe's crisis did not start with a war, it started with a budget. In the late 90s, the government ran up bills it could not cover. Large, unbudgeted payouts to war veterans, then an expensive military intervention in the Congo. From the year 2000, a chaotic land reform program collapsed commercial farming, which had been the country's export engine. Output fell, tax revenue fell, and foreign lenders left. Enormous bills, no taxes, no lenders. One working machine. You know this song. But Zimbabwe added its own verse because the central bank became convinced that the real problem was the zeros. In 2006, it cut 3 zeros off the currency in a program literally named Operation Sunrise. The printing continued, so the zeros grew back. In 2008, it cut 10 more. By mid-2008, the Statistics Office measured annual inflation at 231 million%, and then simply stopped publishing. Independent estimates put the November 2008 peak at 79.6 billion% per month, with prices doubling roughly every 25 hours. At one point that year, a single egg cost around $50 billion. In January 2009 came the finale, the $100 trillion note. And credit where it is due. Hungary's record note hid its zeros behind a word. Zimbabwe printed all 14 digits across the front, which is still the most zeros ever displayed on a banknote. 3 weeks later, the bank cut 12 more zeros. 25 zeros deleted in 3 years, which is also a world record. 2 months after that, the Zimbabwe dollar was dead. Let's make the mechanism explicit because this is the whole lesson. A redenomination changes the label on the money. It changes nothing about the deficit and nothing about the printing that finances it. If the press keeps running, you have not stopped inflation. You have scheduled the next redenomination. And notice how misleading the doubling numbers are. 25 hours in Zimbabwe against 15 in Hungary sounds like the same league. It is not because doubling compounds. Doubling every 25 hours multiplies prices about 500 million times in a month. Doubling every 15 hours multiplies them by hundreds of trillions. Those 10 hours are a factor of roughly 500,000 every single month. So what finally stopped Zimbabwe's inflation? The same thing that stopped Hungary's, which is taking away the printing press, just by a much cruder method. In 2009, Zimbabwe gave up on having its own money at all. The US dollar and the South African rand became legal tender, and the local dollar was abandoned. Inflation stopped almost immediately, for the simple reason that Zimbabwe cannot print US dollars. For several years, inflation ran below 4%. Some years it was negative. When the old dollar was formally buried in 2015, bank balances were converted at 35 quadrillion Zimbabwe dollars to $1 US. Problem solved then? Not quite. Using someone else's money means having no press at all, even for legitimate needs, and no control over your own money supply. Physical cash ran short, and so began the sequels. 2016, the bond note. Officially not a currency, just a note pegged 1-to-1 with the US dollar, by decree. The market looked at it and, before long, priced it lower. 2019, the bond notes and electronic balances were rebranded as a reborn Zimbabwe dollar, and for a while, using foreign currency was actually banned. By 2020, annual inflation was back above 800%. 2024, attempt number 6. The ZiG, short for Zimbabwe Gold, launched in April, backed by roughly 2.5 tons of gold and $100 million at the central bank. This time, the government insisted it would be different. 5 months later, it was devalued by 43% in a single day. And yet, in fairness, since that devaluation, the ZiG has held surprisingly steady at around 25 to the dollar officially, with the bank reporting reserves above $1 billion. That is the best behavior any Zimbabwean currency has managed in decades. It is also still being avoided. Around 80% of transactions in the country happen in US dollars, the street rate runs well above the official one, and in 2026 the bank had to reissue the physical notes because the first batch was fading and falling apart in people's hands. The paper, once again, providing symbolism nobody asked for. The official plan is for the ZiG to become Zimbabwe's only currency by 2030. The population so far is hedging. Meanwhile, the $100 trillion note found a second career. Collectors today pay serious money for a crisp one, often more than the note could buy for most of its working life. Zimbabwe's best-performing asset of 2009 turned out to be its money, but only after it stopped being money. So put the two stories side by side. Hungary had the worst inflation ever recorded. Prices doubling every 15 hours, a banknote with 20 zeros, an entire money supply worth less than a cent. It was cured almost overnight. Not because the zeros were crossed out, but because the new currency arrived with gold in the vault, a budget that added up, and a law against printing for the government. And the public could see all three. Zimbabwe had the second worst and has now reached currency number 6 in under 20 years because each new one asked for trust upfront and then behaved exactly like the last one. That is the whole lesson. The zeros are decoration. The promise is the money. You can print as many zeros as you like. You cannot print trust. For more videos that explain interesting topics about the world, subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one.